Okay, good evening everybody from the Whole Foods parking lot in New Hampshire. I'm living the volleyball mom dream in my minivan. I am sitting in the front row tonight because I have a complication in the back, which you may or may not hear. It's really crowded tonight at Whole Foods. I'm not quite sure why. So if it's too distracting out there, you're gonna be alerted. I'll just leave it at that. So, okay. Tonight is our third in the random verse series, and if you've been following along, you know I post the verse on Monday, and then that gives you time to go out and try and apply some of the principles we've been talking about in this whole minivan theology thing, and see what you come up with. So this was a doozy. I'm not gonna lie. I was glad to see Leviticus in our random verse for this week because it meant we won't get Leviticus again. The concession I'm giving to this whole random verse thing is that I am forcing an Old Testament, New Testament every other week, and I'm also not allowing duplicates because I'm only going to do 10 of these. So you could get 10 out of Leviticus. Whew, and that's 9 too many is what that is. So we're going to just do one, and it is Leviticus 11:19. So I don't know if anybody did this already, but I will just read you the verse. Well, actually, I've got it up here on my computer, so I didn't have to do this quite yet. But the verse says, and it just jumps right in, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. Now I'm just going to pause and say, I thought it was pronounced hoopoe, but it's pronounced hoopoe. And those of you who know my dad know that, of course, right away, there he was, with a photo of a hoopoe that he saw in South Africa one time. So I don't know if there's some sort of obscure weird thing. Dad has a photo of it. Thanks, Dad. So it's pronounced hoopoe. And that's our verse. I hope that you have learned from this entire minivan theology series, whether it was the magnet verses or this random verse one, that you can go ahead and complete those sentences. So if our verse is a fragment, go ahead and read the whole thing. So I'm going to do that briefly so that we put our verse into context. Which means that, it's long. We got to start up here in verse 13. And these you shall detest among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are detestable. The eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, the falcon of any kind, every raven of any kind, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, the hawk of any kind, the little owl, the cormorant, the short-eared owl, the barn owl, the tawny owl, the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron of any kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. Okay, so that's our verse. Leviticus, gotta love it. Listen, Leviticus is super fun. This is gonna be like, there ain't no party like a Leviticus party. Whoop, whoop. All right, so we're gonna do our little postcard, who, what, when. You get the postcard. Your postcard says, the hoopoe. You're like, great, this is a great postcard. I don't know if I'm gonna visit that place actually. But what do we learn from a postcard? We learn who it's to and who it's from. And so in this case, Leviticus, tradition, most scholars, most people in church land do believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He wrote most of it. He wrote it, because he was the one that was talking with God up on Mount Sinai. God was giving him the law, telling him, the things. It's not like Moses was in the Garden of Eden, right? So he wasn't there, but he was hearing all of this from God. Are there some pieces in the Pentateuch that probably were not written by Moses? Yes, of course, including, for example, the part where Moses dies. Probably didn't write that himself. So it's possible that in later years, other people helped compile the Pentateuch and put it all together, but the main author, we believe was Moses. So that's our who. And who's it to? Well, it's to the people of Israel at first. It's to record their history. I mean, Genesis tells the creation story. Exodus tells the story of how they became a people, how they went into Egypt, and then how God brought them out of Egypt. And then we get Leviticus, which we're in tonight, and it talks a lot about the ways that they are to live as God's people. Numbers talks about who they are as God's people, and Deuteronomy gets back to the law. And so there's just a lot of richness in the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's to the people that it's about. But then, as all of the Bible, it becomes to all believers and followers of Jesus because it's God's inspired word. So that's the who. And then we get to the what. You remember I've talked about this sort of has to do with like genre, like what is the book of Leviticus if you went to a literary scholar. Now, I love my ESV study Bible, and I love it because sometimes it's got some funky stuff. And so in this case, I would say Leviticus is law. That's the genre I put it in. It's law. That's simple. It's a 3-letter word, law. But oh no, the ESV study Bible, it likes to say, oh, this book has affinities with utopian literature. I mean, I don't even know what to do about that. Is that like, I don't know, is that like a sci-fi book? It's a book that describes how people will live in an ideal society. So, okay, that's fair. Leviticus is describing this holy God who has a people that he calls to be holy and what that would look like for them to be holy. So I guess if that's utopian literature, here we are. That's what it is. We learn something new every day. And so that's what Leviticus is. And then we have the who, what, and the when is the postmark. The Pentateuch would have been written approximately all around the same time. I'm not going to get super into this except that it's old. And if you really want to go down the rabbit trail of when was the Pentateuch written, you have to pick a date. And so in the beginning of my Bible, there at the very beginning of the ESV Study Bible, there's a whole thing on the date of Exodus, and it doesn't mean the book of Exodus, it means the date of the Exodus, because the Pentateuch dating for all of the books hinges on who was the Pharaoh at the time of the Exodus. And there's two different schools of thought. There's an early date and a late date. I mean, they're both like a gazillion years ago. It's like the 12th century BC or the 13th century BC. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's long enough ago that it doesn't really matter to us. It's like long ago. But you know, if you're somebody who's into history, you can go through and read the different reasons why some scholars choose one date over the other based on context clues in the whole of the Pentateuch, having to do with mentions of certain pharaohs or cities or locations or, you know, genealogies. And there's pretty compelling evidence for both, and we're just going to leave it at that and say it's old. And that's our date. So who, what, when, that's our postcard. Okay, well, we are going to actually go visit the Grand Canyon. In this case, we're going to go check out that hoopoe. And I like saying it. It's not the hoopoe. And look at our where. So we're asking ourselves, we're driving up to the rim of the Grand Canyon, and we're like, where are we? How did we get here? What's going on? Good question, especially when you're talking about all these birds and then like the token bat. Leviticus is divided into two sections for the most part. You know, you can always get a little squirrely with this kind of stuff. But it's generally chapters 1 through 16 and then chapter 17 through 26. So our verse, chapter 11, verse 19, falls in that first section. And they would say the first section has to, they being scholars, or like, I'm just getting this all from the intro in my Bible. Remember, no fancy degree that you need. You just need a good study Bible, or, you know, a good Bible online software or website, Bible study tools or something like that. Is that the beginning section of this is that ours falls in is sort of the priestly or the ceremonial sorts of laws, and then the second half is a little bit more of like the judicial laws or the festival laws. These phrases we're going to get to in a second, they sort of are all over the map depending on which Bible you're reading, but there is a way to categorize all of the stuff that's in Leviticus. I know if you're out there and you've read Leviticus, you're like, it's the craziest book. And I know it is. You're doing your own thing, and suddenly you're hearing about, like, you know, skin boils. Ugh. But there's a point to all of this. And so it's good to sort of get some of these buckets and these categories. And yeah, each Bible has sort of its own system, but we're going to talk about the main system that most people use when thinking about approaching this book and the laws in, you know, there's laws in Exodus and in Deuteronomy as well. So that's up to our Grand Canyon, and we're like, you know, where are we? And then why did we make this road trip? What happened? It was so nice back there in the Whole Foods parking lot. Why did we leave? Why did we come to Leviticus? Why? Well, okay, this is where we're going to talk a little bit about what are the categories of laws. So if you're in church land, you know Leviticus is full of some just crazy stuff, like two different fabrics can't be together, and like I said, the skin stuff. And now here we've got this list of birds. If you're not from church land and I just read that verse to you, you're probably like, well, you might have already left. But if you're still with us, the whole point of the Pentateuch, when, you know, Moses writes all 5 books, it's to record the history of God. Remember, it's one story, and we're not the main character. God's the main character. It's the story of God, and he's a holy God making a way for this people that he's called his own. And in the Old Testament, it's the Israelites, to be in relationship with him, to approach him. But he's holy and they're not. Like, that's sort of the main theme for like most of the Old Testament is God is holy and the people aren't. And he makes a way for them to atone for their lack of holiness or their sins. And this is part of the way. But the other thing you have to remember is that originally when they left Egypt, and they were in the wilderness, it was a theocracy. So the form of government actually was a form of government that had God, the divine Yahweh God, as their leader. It wasn't meant to be a government that was run by humans. Now, eventually they got a human king. Didn't go well. But the intention was that this was going to be a theocracy. They were this people, this holy, special, chosen people that God called out of Egypt, and he was going to design this, utopian society for the people if they would do all of these things. Spoiler alert, they don't do all the things. And he was the holy God, they would be his holy chosen people. And so a lot of what we get in here can be broken down into three sorts of laws, and it's the moral law, it's the civil law, and it's the ceremonial law. Now, I don't always love those exact categories. You're going to get a lot of blurriness, but if we're just going to keep it simple here, and we probably should because it's Leviticus, those are the three major categories: moral law, civil law, and ceremonial law. And that's throughout all of the 5 first books of the Old Testament. It's just that Leviticus really mires down into the nitty-gritty details of especially the ceremonial law. Another word for ceremonial might be the priestly law or the sacrificial law. It's sort of the religious aspect of it. But that's funny to say when you're in a theocracy, because everything in a theocracy is, religious. I don't like the word religious, but it's all about God because he's the leader and they're the people. So in some ways, even civil laws would have been religious laws when the leader was God himself. So mostly what those categories mean is moral laws. The best example of the moral law that we have is the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, whether you're in church land or not, I'm sure you've heard of the 10 Commandments. Do not murder, right? And so we still are held to the 10 Commandments. You couldn't murder in the Old Testament. You can't murder today. Do not steal. Couldn't steal in the Old Testament. Can't steal today. But it's trickier because the Old Testaments also say, the old 10 Commandments also say, you shall have no idols. That's God speaking. And so what does that look like to have no idols today? Because it still holds. And so that's a whole nother, we could spend forever on that. But these things still hold. And in fact, when Jesus came, he said it's not just that they hold, but they're actually bigger than you thought they were. Because when the Old Testament says, do not murder, Jesus says, I tell you, if you even are angry in your heart, you have committed murder. So, okay, moral laws are the Old Testament 10 Commandments, laws like that are moral. We are moral creatures, whether we act like it or not, because God is moral and we are created in his image. And so morality is part of our design. We don't get it right. In fact, we mostly get it wrong. But it's because we're created in God's image. So the moral laws still hold. The civil laws were the laws that were like, if you fall into a pit and your neighbor's ox breaks his leg, then you have to give him his ox. And, if you walk in and curse your parents, they're allowed to take you outside the village and, stone you. I mean, it's some crazy stuff. I'm not going to say it's not, but it's because God was giving them, it's like the speeding tickets of the day. It's like the civil laws to make a government of people that can work and live and, do the things that you need to do to have a productive society. That's what the civil laws were. Again, it gets a little blurry because it's a theocracy. So sometimes the civil laws feel more like what we would call a religious sort of law, but that's because of the kind of world they were living in. But then we get to ceremonial, and this is where we are today with our hoopoe and the bat and all of the clean, unclean. So you've probably heard about, you shouldn't wear a garment that has 2 fibers. I think I'm wearing mostly cotton tonight. I thought about is there a garment but then that was that'd be hot. I might get sticky. I'm wearing cotton, so it's just 1 fiber. But no garments with 2 fibers. It's things like the house and the wall. There's all these laws about if there's a patch of mold in your wall, what to do. You don't just call the exterminator. You don't put some bleach on it. There's a whole thing you have to do. And the clean, unclean animals, the ceremonial laws. So, those are the definitions for our 3 buckets. I'm gonna come back to ceremonial because that's our verse. So that's sort of our why. And now it's time to hike down to that canyon. We've looked around. We're like, well, we're not in the Whole Foods parking lot anymore. We're definitely someplace new. No place like home. And we've learned what the 3 buckets of laws are. So now it's time to go down in the canyon because what does the hoopoe and the bat have to do with the big story? And how does that help us in our everyday lives follow Jesus and think about this big story that God invites us into? Well, I'm so glad you asked. So the thing about the ceremonial laws, the clean and unclean, all the sacrifices, the sacrificial system, all the stuff that is frankly a little, gross to us. Like if you've got like a weird patch of skin, all the stuff about sex and like fluids. I mean, oh, enough already. And the way that you can kill an animal or not kill an animal, and this kind of animal and what it chews and what it doesn't chew. And there's two things you do with ceremonial laws. You look back and you look forward. You look back. Why do you look back? Well, remember the Pentateuch, it's the first 5 books of the Bible, and the first book is Genesis. And when in doubt, and people that have been around me long enough know that this is like, I would print it on a t-shirt if I could. When in doubt, you go back to the garden, go back to the garden. What do we learn in the garden? The garden is where that design that I told you about, that the moral were created in God's image, it was still intact. It wasn't broken yet. And what happened in the garden with the fall is we broke that image. We broke the morality part of who we are. And we did that through Adam and Eve, and they did it in relationship with the serpent. And so remember, there's the curses that God places on Adam and Eve and the serpent. And the serpent was cursed to slither about on his belly in the dust. Okay, so all these clean, unclean things having to do with animals, if you, like, this gets super technical, so I'm not gonna go too deep down to the canyon. Like, we're gonna look at that trail, but we're not gonna go that deep. But if you look carefully, most of the animals that are unclean are in some way like slithery or having the dust come up, and they're unable to process, or they're carrion eaters, which means they eat and they devour the dead, or they eat like the birds that we just read. They're birds of prey. Okay, I'm gonna just give a quick little pause about the bat, because I know some of you are like freaking out. You're like, but a bat's not a bird, and does God not understand that a bat's not a bird, and like, isn't that a mistake in the Bible because a bat's not a bird? Calm down. It's just that this was written in either the 12th century or the 13th century BC. They didn't have a Smithsonian Institute back then that could do like taxonomy and like zoology and give them like a whole thing. God knows that a bat is not a bird, but what their taxonomy was back then was flying creatures. And so the bat is a flying creature, and also it resembles a mouse, which is an unclean animal. So it's like a flying mouse, which is what it is. So it's okay. There are some things in the Old Testament that are meant to be understood by the readers of the Old Testament, not from people in 2023. We can take from that the main point, which is the carrion eaters of the birds were considered unclean. And it's not because there's anything inherently wrong with the bird. It's just this constant reminder of people to look back, remember what happened when you interacted and what I did to that animal, the serpent, Satan. And then, of course, the most important thing on this hike down into the canyon is to look forward, because all of this is meant to remind people that you are a special, holy, chosen people who are not going to be unclean forever. And so like the 2 fabrics and like, the blister on the skin, it's because those are corruptions. It's a symbol, it's a reminder that we're not the way we're designed to be. And we're supposed to stay away. So that's the 2 fabrics. You're supposed to be kept separate. You're supposed to be holy from the pagan people in the Israelites' time. But then we get to the New Testament. And in the New Testament, there's a couple passages, Matthew 5:17, Jesus is speaking, and this is, right there in his early ministry. And he says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law. He's not saying throw all this out. He's saying, or the prophets, I have not come to abolish them, but I have come to fulfill them. So Jesus says, all this stuff that you couldn't keep as God's chosen people, because you messed up in the garden and the whole moral design is now cracked and flawed, and that image is broken, I'm going to restore it. That's the whole work of what Christ does for us. That's the whole point of Jesus. He comes and he lives the life that we cannot live, the perfect life, and he fulfills all of this law. He doesn't say, and now don't worry about it. God doesn't require you to be holy. No. Yes, he does. It's just that when God sees us, he sees the work of Jesus, and Jesus is holy. When we continue to go on, you get the story in Acts chapter 10 and 11, and it's about the apostle Peter, who has this dream, where God brings down, up and down on a picnic blanket, or whatever they called it back then, all of the animals that are unclean. So there would have been like a bat on the blanket, or a hoopoe, and God says you can eat it. And Peter's like, I can't eat it, it's unclean, it's unclean. And God says, do not call unclean what I call clean. And this is to say, once Jesus comes and fulfills the law, we don't need to look back and remember, because Jesus has done it for us. I mean, it's always good to look back. We've got the Bible to do that for us now. But you no longer have to live that out in your daily life, this clean and unclean, this separating, the fabrics, all of that. Christ has fulfilled all of that law. And so then you keep on reading in the New Testament and you get to Hebrews, which I really recommend if Leviticus is confusing to you. And we sure don't have any more time tonight, but if Leviticus is confusing, Hebrews is one of the best books at explaining the law, especially chapter 9 and 10. But chapter 10:1 says, since the law has but a shadow of good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Saying, the law was always just a shadow. It was always just a hint of what was to come. And Jesus, and by that, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. That's later on in chapter 10. Jesus comes and fulfills all of the law. And so when you think of the Bible, and here we go with our one story. It's one big story. Leviticus is in the beginning, but Hebrews is back here at the end. It's the same story. God didn't change. He is a holy God, and he requires us to be holy. And the book of Leviticus is showing you all the ways that we're not holy. But Jesus comes and he fulfills it, and he gives us his life and his heart. So when God looks at us, he sees Jesus and he sees the law fulfilled, not because we're so great, but because Jesus is. And that is why Leviticus 11:19 is such a fun verse. And now, who are my guests? Here they are. Hi, boys. I went way over time. Oh, hi, Nitro. Yeah. All right, I went way over time. But all right, thanks for watching. I'll see you on Monday with a new verse.